So I'm going to make my exemplar for Mathematiques 6.8D. I just made my no-show chart. I'm going to keep this handy because after I make my exemplar for my DOL, I'm going to go ahead and go back to this and see if I need to add anything. So here's some really star questions I picked to create my exemplar. I'm going to use these for my DOL. So after I broke down the standard, I went ahead and made it into a daily objective. Students will be able to determine solutions to problems involving area and volume of a given figure using the correct formula. So knowing that, knowing what I did with my no-show, I'm going to go ahead and create my exemplar. I'm going to read through the question twice. Second time, I'm going to underline any words that indicate to me what I need to do or what formula I need to select. So what's the volume of water in cubic feet? Great. And when it's full. Okay, so if I'm filling something up, I know I'm talking about volume. So I know I'm trying to find the volume of water in this rectangular prism. I want my students to go over to their reference sheets and be able to find that formula since they don't have to have it memorized. So here's volume, here's a prism, and what I want all my students to do, and I already have it annotated here, is when they find this formula, I want them to always know that big B stands for the area of the base of the figure. So I already have that annotated. I'm just going to take this formula, copy it over here. So that makes me think, what is the base? When I look at this, how will my students know? Okay, well, I want my students to know that the bases are parallel to each other and that they are the same shape and the same size and that there's only two bases. So that means that the bases are these. There's only two of them. They're the same shape and the same size. They're parallel to each other. So I'm going to shade them in so I know that those are my bases. So now I figured out what that is. Now I need to make sure my students know how to find the height. So I don't want them to pick one of these as the height. I want them to know that height is actually the distance between the two bases. So first thing they're going to have to do is identify where the bases are, then they'll be able to figure out the height. That may not be important for a rectangular prism, but it is going to be important for a triangular prism because they are going to not just do length times width times height on a rectangular or triangular prism. So I'm going to take the big B. I know where that is now. It's one of these two. They're symmetrical, so it doesn't matter which one. Okay, and I want my students to do 4 times 2.5. I'm going to go ahead and convert that into a decimal. So I need to make sure my students have those benchmark fractions into decimal conversions memorized. That's one thing I'm going to note to myself on my no-show chart. So I'm going to note that. Okay, so I broke down big B into 4 times 2.5. It doesn't matter the order here because it's multiplication times the height of the entire figure, which is 7. So that my students know where these numbers are coming from, anything that's aligned to the area of the base, I'm just going to underline so they can keep track of it. Okay, so now I just have to multiply, and I'm also going to write B there so they keep track of everything. Okay, so I'm going to do 4 times 2.5. And then I just do 10 times 7, and that is 70 feet cubed. Okay, so I just did a lot there. I want to make sure that my students do all those steps or something similar. Last thing I want to make sure my students do is check if the answer is reasonable. So is 70 feet cubed reasonable given the dimensions here? Well, let me look at F and G. Okay, those numbers compared to the answer I got are pretty small. So if I know volume, I'm multiplying 3 dimensions by each other, and I just take 2 of the dimensions, not even the third one, and multiply those. I know 7 times 4 is 28. And I haven't even considered this third dimension. 28 is still larger than both of these answers, so I know those aren't reasonable because they're too small. The quantity is too small. Okay. I got H as my answer. J seems a little bit more reasonable because it's closer to the answer I got, so I'm just going to go ahead and double check my math to make sure I wasn't off anywhere. So I said volume is equal to big B times H. I know big B is the area of the bases. Okay, the bases are parallel to each other. They're the same shape and same size, and there's only 2 of them. Okay, so that's true. So 4 times 2.5. Check my math over here. That is correct. So I got 10, and I do 10 times 7, and that's 70. So 76 is not the right answer. I know that because I double checked my math. Those are the steps I would want students to solve when looking at this problem. I can take all the steps I just did and turn them into my aggressive monitoring labs. So the first thing I did is I read the problem twice and I boxed keywords. So what's the second thing I did? I went ahead and I labeled, after I read the problem twice, boxed the keywords, I went ahead and I labeled and highlighted or colored in the bases and the height. So I labeled the bases first, and then I also identified the height. Labeled the bases, identify height. I need to label the bases first before I identify the height. The next thing I did is I wrote the formula, went to my formula chart, okay? So I'm going to make sure when I'm doing my labs that my students have written the correct formula. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to write this down here below my math, is I'm going to make sure that my answer is reasonable and double check my math. So I'm just going to write reasonable double check, math. Okay, so I have my labs written out. I've done my exemplar for one question. I would keep doing more problems before I write my aggressive monitoring labs just to make sure they apply to all the problems I have in my DOL, but this was just a sample. The other thing I want to do is I want to go back to my no-show and see if I missed anything after answering these questions. Okay, so one thing I didn't include in my no-show chart is finding the correct formula and using my formula chart. Okay, so I referenced measuring because I know on this standard I may have to measure some figures, but I didn't say anything about finding correct formula. So I need to know where to find the correct formula.